The trail that disappears. There's a stretch of wilderness in the northeastern United States that very few people know about. A place untouched by time, where the trees grow thicker than anywhere else, and the sunlight barely touches the forest floor. Legends say that people have gone missing there for hundreds of years, their disappearances unsolved, their bodies never found. This story comes from a man named Ethan who hiked the so-called disappearing trail with his best friend, Rob. They didn't believe in the old legends, but they soon learned that some places are dangerous for a reason. Ethan had always been an avid hiker. The outdoors called to him like nothing else. The more remote the trail, the better. He had heard about the disappearing trail from a few hikers on Reddit, an unmarked, unmaintained path somewhere deep in the New England wilderness. People said that it was cursed, that those who walked it either never returned or came back changed, haunted by something they couldn't explain. Ethan didn't believe in curses. To him, it sounded like an adventure. He convinced his friend Rob to come along. Rob wasn't as experienced a hiker, but he trusted Ethan's judgment, and they'd hiked together dozens of times. They packed light just enough for a 2-day trip and set off on a cool autumn morning. The trailhead was hard to find as expected. It wasn't marked on any map, and the directions they found online were vague. After an hour of searching, they came across a narrow path leading into the forest. It looked overgrown, almost hidden by the underbrush, but something about it felt inviting. The first few miles of the hike were uneventful. The forest was dense, with towering trees and thick moss covering the ground. The trail was barely visible in places, more like an animal path than something made for people. But Ethan had a good sense of direction, and he felt confident they were on the right track. By midday, they reached a small clearing and stopped for lunch. As they sat down to eat, Ethan noticed something strange. The forest around them was silent, completely silent. No birds, no insects, not even the rustling of leaves in the wind. He mentioned it to Rob, who shrugged it off. "Maybe there's a predator nearby," Rob said, but Ethan didn't think so. There was something unnatural about the silence. It felt heavy. They continued on, but the further they went, the stranger things became. The path started to narrow, the trees growing closer together, almost like they were closing in on them. Rob joked about needing a machete to cut through the brush, but Ethan was starting to feel uneasy. The trail, which had been hard to follow before, was now almost non-existent. It felt like they were walking deeper into the heart of the forest, far beyond where any trail should lead. By late afternoon, the sun was already starting to set. The thick canopy overhead blocked out most of the light, casting long shadows across the forest floor. Ethan suggested they make camp for the night. They found a small, flat area just off the trail and set up their tent. As they worked, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He glanced over his shoulder every few minutes, half expecting to see someone standing in the trees, but there was nothing. Just the same eerie silence. That night, as they lay in their tent, the silence became suffocating. No wind, no animals, not even the sound of their own breathing seemed to break the stillness. And then they heard it. A faint sound at first, like someone walking through the forest. Slow, deliberate footsteps, coming from just beyond the edge of their camp. Ethan sat up, his heart pounding in his chest. Rob was already awake, his eyes wide with fear. "Did you hear that?" Rob whispered. Ethan nodded. The footsteps stopped, but the tension in the air was thick, almost tangible. They sat in silence, listening, waiting. Then, just as suddenly as they had stopped, the footsteps started again, this time closer. Ethan grabbed his flashlight and unzipped the tent. He stepped outside, shining the beam into the darkness. But there was nothing. The forest was empty, just trees and shadows. The footsteps stopped again. They didn't sleep much that night. Every time they started to drift off, they would hear the footsteps again, circling the camp, stopping, starting, always just out of sight. By morning, they were both exhausted, but Ethan insisted they continue the hike. He didn't want to admit it, but he was starting to feel afraid. Something about this forest, about the trail, was wrong. They packed up their camp and headed deeper into the woods. As they walked, the trail seemed to disappear completely. The underbrush grew thicker, the trees more twisted and gnarled, as if the forest itself was trying to push them out. But Ethan was stubborn. He wasn't about to let some old legend scare him off. Rob, on the other hand, was starting to panic. He kept glancing over his shoulder, muttering about how they should turn back. Then they found it. A cabin, or what was left of one. It was small, almost hidden by the trees. Its roof caved in, and its walls covered in moss. It looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. Maybe longer. Ethan approached cautiously, his flashlight beam flickering as he stepped onto the rotting porch. The door hung open, creaking slightly in the breeze that seemed to come from nowhere. Inside, the air was thick with decay. The floor was covered in debris, leaves, and dirt. But something caught Ethan's eye, a small leather-bound book lying on the table. He picked it up, flipping through the brittle pages. It was a journal, written in shaky handwriting. The entries were short, frantic, and incoherent at times, but one phrase stood out, repeated over and over. "The forest doesn't let you leave." Ethan's heart raced as he read the final entry. "I can hear them outside. They're coming for me. The trees are alive. They don't want me to leave." He dropped the journal and backed out of the cabin, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Rob was standing at the edge of the clearing, staring into the forest. "We need to go," Rob said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We need to get out of here, right now." They started walking quickly, then running. The trail, or what little there was of it, seemed to twist and turn in impossible directions. No matter which way they went, the trees seemed to guide them back to the cabin. It was as if the forest was alive, watching them, waiting for them to make a mistake. As the sun began to set, they realized they were hopelessly lost. The forest around them seemed darker, more oppressive than before. Every tree looked the same, every path a dead end. The footsteps started again, this time louder, faster, as if whatever was following them was getting closer. Ethan was the first to see it, a figure, standing just beyond the trees. At first, he thought it was a person, maybe another hiker, but as he got closer, he realized it wasn't human. Its body was twisted and gnarled, like the trees themselves, its skin rough and bark-like. Its eyes, hollow and black, seemed to stare right through him. They ran, faster than they ever had in their lives, but no matter how fast they went, the figure was always there, just behind them, moving silently through the trees. The footsteps echoed in Ethan's ears, growing louder and louder until they were all he could hear. By the time they reached the clearing where they had camped the night before, Rob was gone. Ethan didn't know when he had lost him or where he had gone, but he didn't stop to look. He didn't dare. He kept running, the footsteps still following him, until finally he saw the trailhead. His car was parked just beyond the trees, a lifeline in the darkness. Ethan never spoke to anyone about what happened in that forest. He filed a missing persons report for Rob, but they never found a trace of him. No body, no backpack, nothing. To this day, Ethan doesn't know what happened on the disappearing trail, but he'll never hike alone again. The wilderness can be a beautiful place, but it can also be dangerous. Some trails are meant to be left alone, and some forests hide secrets that should never be uncovered.